Nobody in that building had ever heard Frank raise his voice before, and nobody could explain why it felt like they'd been rescued by a soldier, not a janitor. "Frank, where did you learn to do that?" she asked, and for the first time in 19 years, he didn't have a quick answer ready. "Sergeant Whitaker," Walter said, loud enough that 3 students turned around. "You're supposed to be dead." When Sarah called his name and asked him to stand, Frank Whitaker rose slowly, and the entire gymnasium rose with him before he'd taken a single step. The gymnasium floor was still wet with mop water when the fire alarm tore through Lincoln High School. Students screamed and scattered toward the exits, but one exit was already blocked by smoke pouring from the science wing. Frank Whitaker, the school janitor, dropped his mop and moved before anyone else did. He shouted directions in a voice that cracked through the panic like a drill sergeant's command, and for one strange moment, the chaos seemed to organize itself around him. Nobody in that building had ever heard Frank raise his voice before, and nobody could explain why it felt like they'd been rescued by a soldier, not a janitor. For 19 years, Frank Whitaker had pushed a broom through these hallways before sunrise, unlocked classroom doors, and fixed leaking pipes without a single student learning his first name. He was 68 years old, quiet and easy to overlook, the kind of man teenagers walked past without a glance. What none of them knew was that Frank had once served 2 tours overseas, earned a Silver Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers out of a collapsed building under fire, and came home to a country that seemed to forget him the moment the parade ended. He never talked about the war. He kept his medals in a shoebox at the back of a closet, wrapped in an old undershirt, and told anyone who asked that he'd simply worked security for a while. The truth felt too heavy to hand to strangers, and heavier still to hand to himself. So he mopped floors, fixed lockers, and let the silence do the work that words couldn't. Some mornings he arrived 2 hours before the first bell, just to have the hallways to himself, the quiet, the only thing that still felt like his. Teachers waved at him the way people wave at weather, a polite acknowledgement of something always there and rarely considered. A few students had nicknamed him Ghost because he seemed to appear and vanish without anyone noticing the space in between, fixing a jammed locker and disappearing before a thank you could catch up to him. Frank had built an entire second life out of being forgettable, and for 19 years it had worked exactly the way he needed it to. Principal Sarah Doyle had taken over the school 2 years earlier, and she liked Frank the way you like furniture that's always been there. Reliable, unremarkable, present. She signed his paperwork, nodded at him in the hallway, and never once wondered what he'd done before this building needed a janitor. That began to change the morning after the fire drill, when the district superintendent called asking pointed questions about the man who organized an evacuation like he'd done it 100 times. Sarah found herself standing outside the supply closet, watching Frank restock paper towels, trying to reconcile the calm command she'd witnessed with the man in front of her now, folded in on himself, avoiding her eyes. "Frank, where did you learn to do that?" she asked, and for the first time in 19 years, he didn't have a quick answer ready. He gave her the security guard story again, the same 3 sentences he'd used for 2 decades, but this time it sounded thin even to him. Sarah didn't push, but something in her had already started asking questions she couldn't stop. Later that afternoon, she pulled his original hiring file from the district archive, hoping to find a previous employer she could quietly call. The file was thin, almost empty, missing nearly a decade of history between his discharge and the day he was hired to sweep these hallways. It read like a man who had tried very hard to leave no trace. Frank went home that night to his small apartment above the hardware store and sat with the shoebox open on his lap for the first time in years, running his thumb over a medal he'd never let anyone see. He thought about the men he'd carried out of that building overseas, 2 of whom were still alive because of him, and 1 who wasn't. He thought about how easy it had been to disappear into a mop and a set of keys, and how disappearing had felt safer than being seen. 3 days later, a delivery truck pulled into the school parking lot, dropping off boxes for a Veterans Day assembly the school held every year without much fanfare. The man signing for the delivery introduced himself to the front office as Walter Reyes, a volunteer with a local veterans support organization bringing memorial flags for the ceremony. He was walking through the main hallway toward the gymnasium when he stopped mid-step, staring at a man in a gray janitor's uniform waxing the floor near the trophy case. "Sergeant Whitaker," Walter said, loud enough that 3 students turned around. "You're supposed to be dead." Frank froze, the buffer still humming in his hands, and looked up into the face of a man he hadn't seen in almost 40 years. Walter had been one of the wounded soldiers Frank pulled from the wreckage that day, carried nearly a quarter-mile under fire with a shattered leg and a collapsed lung. He'd spent decades trying to track down the man who saved his life, only to learn years ago that Frank had been reported missing in a records mix-up after his discharge, his file lost in a paperwork transfer that never got corrected. Walter had assumed, like the Army database did, that Frank simply never came home. He had even attended a memorial ceremony years earlier where Frank's name was read alongside soldiers who genuinely hadn't survived, standing in a crowd mourning a man who was, at that very moment, 3 states away installing new locks on a supply closet. Walter had carried that grief for over a decade, never once imagining he might one day find the man alive, unremarkable, and completely at peace behind a mop. Word spread through the school before lunch, teachers pulling students out of class just to see the janitor everyone thought they knew, standing in the hallway, being embraced by a stranger who kept saying thank you like the word wasn't big enough. By the time the Veterans Day assembly began that Friday, the gymnasium was packed tighter than anyone could remember, parents and staff filling the bleachers meant for 300 students. Principal Sarah Doyle had spent the week quietly working with Walter's organization and the school district to correct Frank's records and formally present the recognition he'd never received. Frank sat in a folding chair near the stage in his same gray uniform, refusing every offer to wear something else, insisting this was who he was now. When Sarah called his name and asked him to stand, Frank Whitaker rose slowly, and the entire gymnasium rose with him before he'd taken a single step. Walter told the story of the collapsed building, his voice breaking twice, while photos of a much younger Frank in uniform flashed on the screen behind him. Students who had walked past Frank in the hallway for years without a second look now stood clapping until their hands ached, some of them crying without fully understanding why. The boy who had started the Ghost nickname stood at the very front of the crowd, no longer laughing, just watching a man he realized he had never actually seen. Sarah presented Frank with a framed set of his corrected service records alongside the medals he'd kept hidden in a shoebox for 4 decades and asked if he had anything he wanted to say. Frank looked out at hundreds of faces that had never known his story and finally spoke the words he'd swallowed for 40 years. "I didn't do it for medals," he said. "I did it so the men beside me could go home to their families. I just never expected anyone to notice I made it home too." The gymnasium was silent for one long breath, and then it wasn't. Frank still shows up before sunrise to unlock the doors, but now the students know his name, and more than a few of them stop to say it. This story is a fictional tribute inspired by the quiet courage of veterans who carried their service home in silence, the ones who never asked to be seen but deserved to be. If a story like this moved you, consider sharing it and honoring the veterans in your own life who may still be waiting to be truly seen.